The attempted assassination of Donald Trump marks the latest descent of the United States into the abyss. Now, of course, political violence in the US is hardly new. Well, violence of any description in the United States is hardly new. 4 sitting presidents have been assassinated. Abraham Lincoln, who led the Union to victory, of course, in the Civil War, he was assassinated in 1865. James A. Garfield, 1881. William McKinley, 1901. And of course, John F. Kennedy in 1963. The 1960s was a particularly notorious decade for political assassination. JF Kennedy's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, was assassinated in 1968. That was a couple of months after Martin Luther King was also assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated 3 years before. In 1980, there was an attempt to assassinate Ronald Reagan by John Warnock Hinckley Jr. In his case, because he was fixated with the Hollywood actress Jodie Foster and thought it would impress her. He was found not guilty for reasons of insanity and placed in institutional care. Important to note that case because, of course, we don't, as of the time I'm filming this, know the exact circumstances of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump.
And if you want to really see something that's said, take a look at what happened.
What we do know is a 20-year-old man named Thomas Matthew Crooks was the shooter, and that he was killed on the scene, and that he has apparently a very limited imprint on the internet, that he is a registered Republican, that he also made a small donation to the Liberal campaign group Act Blue, that he was on a rooftop 200 to 250 yards away from where Trump was speaking to his supporters in Butler, Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania is a key swing state in the upcoming presidential elections. Donald Trump had very narrowly carried that state in 2016 when he defeated Hillary Clinton. 4 years later, Joe Biden very narrowly carried it too when he defeated Donald Trump. We know that a witness saw Crooks with a rifle and tried to point him out to the police before he opened fire, killing one and critically injuring 2 others and piercing Donald Trump's ear with a bullet. Now, Trump is a man who I think it's fair to say energetically moves around a lot when he's doing his big speeches, and with a very slightly different movement on his part, we would now likely be discussing his assassination. Now, obviously, such assassinations are wrong in every sense, clearly. I don't support assassinating political leaders, regardless of whether they are deeply reactionary, bigoted, and indeed dangerous. We should be honest, this could not have been a bigger boost for Donald Trump's campaign. The footage of Donald Trump after he was nearly killed, blood pouring down his face, defiantly pumping his fist, mouthing the words "fight, fight, fight," while the audience chanted "USA, USA, USA." Well, frankly, that footage could not have been scripted to be more profoundly emotionally affecting for a large section of the American people. Indeed, that image of him surrounded by Secret Service agents, 2 wearing sunglasses, as he defiantly raises his fist in the air, the stars and stripes fluttering behind him. You look at it and you think, badass. Those images will end up becoming some of the most iconic pictures of our time. Well, Joe Biden and other Democrats have condemned this assassination attempt. Let's be honest, this is catastrophic for Biden, completely catastrophic. Since his disastrous performance at the debate with Donald Trump, a view has cemented amongst most Americans who can see and hear that Biden is just not capable mentally of being president of the United States of America. He has clearly sharply declined, and those around him have clearly conspired to cover up his condition. They have lied to the American people. Americans will rightly ask who is actually running the country, and they will regard with contempt the idea that Joe Biden could in any realistic way lead the American nation for another 4.5 years. They will regard that as absurd. And that is the total time that Biden is set to remain in the White House. What do we think Biden's going to be like in a year, let alone 2 years? I mean, in a sense, it's irrelevant. What I think the American people have made their minds up. Now, in contrast, they've now been served up with Donald Trump defiantly rallying a crowd after nearly being assassinated. I was pretty sure Donald Trump was going to be elected in November. Well, you'd be pretty brave to bet against that now, wouldn't you? Some general observations. The US remains incapable of having a reckoning, of course, with its toxic relationship with guns. 1.6 million Americans have been killed by guns since John Lennon was assassinated in 1980. Every day, an average of 327 Americans are shot, and over a third of them are killed. By the time you finish listening to me, more Americans will have been shot dead. There will be more horror and grief at the fate of Donald Trump's ear than there has been for little kids mowed down in schools. The 20-year-old shooter was too young to buy a bottle of beer, too young to rent a car, but he was old enough to buy a gun. Now, the failure of the US security services in a deeply polarised nation in which guns are rampant to secure the rooftops around the rally of a presidential nominee in the run-up to the election, well, it's not exactly indicative of a superpower, which is at the top of its game, is it? Now, we are being told now that the rhetoric of Democrats and indeed Biden himself has led to this assassination attempt. And again, we don't even know the circumstances of this assassination or the motives. Well, let's put it this way. Those who have spent so long claiming that inflammatory rhetoric has no consequences have rather changed their tune, have they not? No presidential nominee of a major party has ever engaged in the sort of inflammatory rhetoric of Donald Trump, who incited an actual insurrection in January 2021 in an attempt to overturn the presidential elections in which he was defeated. And 5 people were killed. 5 people died during that insurrection. And of course, his allies have also engaged in that kind of rhetoric. I mean, as an example, after a far-right conspiracy theorist invaded the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi's home, and attacked her husband with a hammer, leaving him with a fractured skull, Donald Trump Jr. tweeted, "Got my poor Pelosi Halloween costume ready," with, of course, a big hammer, picture of a hammer attached to that tweet. There has been a surge in far-right terrorism in the US and indeed elsewhere. In 2005 to 7, there were 7 right-wing terrorist incidents. By 2017 to 19, there were 27. By 2020 to 22, that figure increased to 40. Between 2011 to 2022, 61.5% of domestic extremist-related killings were perpetrated by right-wing extremists, compared to just over 23% by domestic Islamist extremists, and 11.5% by left-wing anarchists, defined as including anarchists and black nationalists. Now, that's important to state, because we will now hear constant attempts to both sides this. It should also be noted that the US state has no qualms in exporting and facilitating violence on a mass scale, in which tens of millions have been killed. As an example now, of course. One example. Just one example in the sordid history of American exported and facilitated violence, Israel's genocidal onslaught in Gaza, armed to the teeth by the US state, including, of course, little kids being sniper shotted in the head, maybe with American bullets. As the Palestinian-American Omar Barda puts it, hundreds of politicians who armed, funded and cheered on the slaughter of 16,000 plus children over the last 9 months are about to tell you that violence is a terrible thing that can never be excused or condoned. There will be far more outrage over the fate of Donald Trump's ear than those thousands of Palestinian kids burned and cooked to death or slowly suffocated in the rubble or sniper shot in the head or run over by tanks. Once again, underlining just how grotesquely cheap Palestinian life is. Israel's Foreign Minister, Israel Katz, had the front to tweet, "I am shocked by the shooting at the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump. I pray for his speedy recovery. Violence can never, ever be part of politics." Leaving aside the genocidal rampage being perpetrated by Israel, assassinations are something of a forte for the state. But the fact is, it now is much harder to hold a martyred Trump to account for the genuine danger he poses to the American Republic. He has objectively said he will lock up his opponents. He has publicly floated cancelling the Constitution, suggested he will be a dictator for one day, incited, again, an insurrection, lauded right-wing extremists. The truth is that the Democrats are in a catastrophic position in these circumstances. And it's not just the striking mental decline of Biden, of course, to blame. Trump energizes his base. He enthuses his base. By supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza, Biden and his team have done the exact opposite with their base. Younger Americans, Muslim Americans, Americans of colour, all key elements, constituencies of the Democratic electoral coalition, the sorts of people the Democrats expect to go and campaign for them. They've been appalled, repulsed by this genocide and Biden's role in it. The Democrats often rely on simply denouncing Trump for the danger he poses without being able to enthuse their base. Now, look, I've got huge admiration for Bernie Sanders, but I must confess I'm disturbed by the position he has taken. Yesterday, he wrote for the New York Times, throwing his full weight behind Biden. He wrote, "I will do all I can to see that President Biden is re-elected. Why, despite my disagreements with him on particular issues, he has been the most effective president in the modern history of our country and is the strongest candidate to defeat Donald Trump, a demagogue and a pathological liar." Disagreements on particular issues is not, let's put it this way, a wise way of describing the mass butchery of Palestinians armed and facilitated by Joe Biden. But also, what is the strategy here exactly? Various left-wing political figures seem to think they have now an in with Biden and he'll support more progressive policies in the second term. Well, what is the point in that exactly? The US left is looking at an impending catastrophic defeat for Biden, and they're seeking to tie themselves to it. Why? To what end? I just don't get it. I would note that back in 1983, after Labour was in turmoil in Britain, the Thatcher government had won the Falklands War and was riding a wave of jingoism. The right wing of the Labour Party had split and set up a new party, the Social Democrats, splitting the left of centre vote. And in that context, right-wing figures in the Labour Party, do you know what they did? They voted through every single left-wing policy they could. Why? Because they wanted to tie the defeat to left-wing policies. What Bernie Sanders and his crew seem to be doing, and I hugely admire Bernie Sanders, is what? Seeking to tie them to this defeat. I don't get it. Look, you can only now fear for a terrible darkness in the United States with horrendous consequences for the rest of the world. Donald Trump is a right-wing authoritarian demagogue. I have to keep saying that. It's true. And history tells us what such political figures do. They marshal this form of violence for authoritarian ends. They use such violence to justify repressing their opponents and suppressing democracy. You've got to fear that after a Trump victory, there'll be turmoil on the streets. Trump will enforce shoot to kill. We know that his former Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, has said that Donald Trump suggested shooting dead Black Lives Matter protesters. And this time round, Donald Trump is surrounded by ever more extreme figures. His supposedly moderate entourage has peeled away in disgust. And he was already vengeful, enraged, and more radicalised. Now, you can imagine a cycle of such protests, protesters being killed, and then authoritarian measures being imposed. Perhaps martial law, the National Guard being sent in. Where will it end? And then who knows how things could escalate. An attempt to impose an overtly authoritarian right-wing dictatorship, perhaps. In the United States of America, US democracy overturned, and then many Americans refusing to accept such a fate. But we also know how, let's be honest, who's got the most guns in the United States? It's not generally the people opposed to Donald Trump, is it? It's a nightmare. It's an absolute nightmare. You have to hope, of course, that that worst case scenario will not transpire. But the polling shows that large numbers of Americans fear civil war. I mean, you kind of fear, just talking about it makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, I doubt what I say has any impact in that regard. But what do? Ignore reality? We should be clear about this. It does feel like we're trapped in a gruesome sci-fi film in which we're somehow looking back at flashbacks of how a dystopian dictatorship was installed. But it does show the desperate need for a form of politics which can inspire enough Americans to overcome the crisis and turmoil that a broken economic order has imposed. The US is a superpower in sharp decline, and the danger is of a deeply disturbing political response to that. But the darkness that we're discussing is not inevitable. The left in the US has to come up with a strategy, though, and fast, because so much is at stake. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your thoughts, comments. Love to hear them as ever. Please press like, subscribe, keep the show on the road at patreon.com/ownjoseph. Speak to you soon.